You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Today we're talking about Spun by Wolfe.
So we don't usually get the opportunity to go to a show of the artist that we're talking about. Before we get to record the episode, we actually got to do that with Wolfe. She came through Atlanta, 5 days ago?
Unfortunately, we didn't. You did. But I've seen her a number of times before.
Right.
This was your first time seeing her, right?
Yeah. You foremost, and then a number of other people have always told me to go see her. And it's just one of those, as a person who goes to a lot of concerts, frustratingly elusive timing just comes through, and it just never works out for whatever reason. So it finally did, which I can't necessarily say that I would recommend going to a Wolfe concert by yourself.
Especially not the one where she's virtually solo, mostly acoustic.
Yeah, which was fun because I wanted to make sure that I saw, we changed the recording schedule around so I could go to the show first, although at the time you thought you could go. And then it turns out that in this tour specifically, she's playing 0 songs from this album. But
because it's like the new record, Birth of Violence, is kind of almost a direct response to the record we're talking about today.
Right.
Because her career got heavier and heavier and heavier. And then she put out this record. And after that, it was like, oh my God, I need a palate cleanser. And I can't wait to talk about all the ways that this record is unbelievably heavy.
The thing I did get that I was hoping to get, though, was a sense of the mood that somehow she is able to go from initially creating to forcibly enveloping you in extremely quickly. I've seen a lot of good shows in my lifetime. I don't even know that I would really classify this as that. It was impossible to look away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to the point to where when on occasion someone would speak in the audience to another person, 8 people would turn around like it was a movie theater scene in Seinfeld, just like, hey, would you mind? Like, I literally saw somebody tap someone on the shoulder and go, hey, I don't mean to be rude to you, but I really need you to be quiet. Is that okay? And then they hugged, and then they were quiet.
In 2019.
It was outrageous, right? But I got what I wanted out of it, which was really stepping into that feeling. And after having listened to a number of records from her, this was always my favorite, but I'd never gotten a chance to kind of experience. It was hard for me to connect the dots in the records themselves with how does someone evoke so much in so many different genres, for lack of a better word.
That don't make any sense together on paper.
And yet his Spun is perfectly executed in a genre that she had not really done previously and really doesn't necessarily seem to be doing again. And it was helpful, I would say, to feel that sensation and watch her command the entire audience, command the attention of a lot of people for a pretty long show without a pause, and having that interesting contrast of how, like you said, she's kind of haunting. And I felt like she was making direct eye contact with everyone in the room, like those weird paintings. It was really interesting to see someone so naturally move between a very extremely reserved, quiet, and giving you the impression that she's probably pretty shy in person. And yet, as soon as the music would swell, was able to take on a totally different persona and it not feel disconnected. It wasn't then like an Alice Cooper type thing.
Right.
It was like there's an extension of her personality that she's able to turn on and off.
All these things occupy the same body.
Right.
And by contrast, the last time that I saw her, I've probably seen her 5 or 6 times at this point. The last time I saw her was at Desert Days last year. So outside, middle of the night, pretty much, by a body of water in the desert, by a mountain range, very surreal, psychedelic. And she had these black and red lava and lightning visuals, and it was on the tour for this album, so it was extremely heavy. And you didn't get the pleasure of seeing her with her drummer Jess, who was integral to this record. And I mean, seeing her in that environment with that huge stage and sound setup, it was seismic. Like it felt real earthquakey. So I think it's interesting that we had contrasting experiences because everything I read around this, like there's so much around Chelsea Wolfe that's about contrast that people can't rectify. I was thinking about, she recently posted about Joni Mitchell's birthday and how Joni Mitchell was an idol to her.
But she's doing a Joni Mitchell cover on this tour.
Right. Yeah. And I recently learned about how very early on in her career, she had a decently well-circulated Burzum cover that she then ultimately had to like disavow her early love of Burzum because, you know, we were all kids once. But I was just thinking about who else could you be talking about Joni Mitchell and Burzum in the same sentence, occupied in the same body other than Chelsea Wolfe? And people use all these things like light and dark, fragile and heavy, folk and metal. And she's very hard to make sense of. And when you and I were talking on Slack about this, I was talking about her singularity and how like in 20 years, we're going to be having a conversation where we're finally catching up with her and we finally understand what she was trying to do. Artists like Chelsea Wolfe make me realize how much we rely on precedent to make sense of new things. Because she's very hard to make sense of. Like there's nothing that sounds like her. When she does stuff like this, people are relying on, oh, you sound like Sun or Swans or black metal or Sabbath maybe, or you got the guy from Queen, so maybe this sounds like Queens of the Stone Age. But then you do the soft stuff and then it's kind of folky and I don't, what are you? Who is Chelsea Wolfe? Next on Fresh Air. And that's kind of incredible to me that this person who is so inward and doesn't seem to work too hard to project or articulate, this is who I am. This is who you need to know that I am. This is how to talk about me. Here's the brand guide to Chelsea Wolfe, that she can prompt these kinds of conversations and be like Josh Homme always says about the Stooges. Like they were 30 years ahead of their time. Like name somebody else who was so misunderstood for so long. And maybe that's not the same because people seem to intuitively understand her or that she's cool. Like you said, you couldn't look away. Nobody in the room could look away. There's something arresting about her, and that's kind of good enough.
Speaking of Queens of the Stone Age, one of the many reasons this particular album is worth talking about is because all of the connection points that it has with almost everything that we love, maybe.
It's like all the cool, heavy stuff is represented here. I think it says something that the gang she has around her on this are like all the coolest and most interesting, other unique, heavy people. But yeah, specifically the ones that we really, really like a lot. Like this hit some really personal notes for us. And I don't think either of us knew that. We listened to it, and I don't think either of us knew that before we really started digging in. And it was like, oh, well, that's why. Of course, that's why I like this.
I knew there was a connection with Converge, but I didn't know how deep it ran, or certainly what the history of it was. But on top of it being a fun thing to talk about, an easy thing to talk about maybe for us, another reason I think that she's worth talking about in the context of all the other records that we've talked about this season and others, I, as of yet, don't know that I would necessarily file her in the taxonomy alongside Otis Redding, right? And that's just because it's yet to be seen. She just needs more time, maybe. But she sticks out as an artist the way that, as strange as the musical connection would be here, in the way that Joanna Newsom stood out to me, where you hear them for the first time and they feel like someone made them in a laboratory. They're so good. Mm-hmm. And I even was texting you during the show trying to figure out, literally, is she lip syncing? I have seen a lot of shows and a lot of really good shows, and I have never seen a vocal performance at the level of perfection that she seemed to casually execute on. It appeared so effortless that it bothered me.
The text says, all lowercase, no punctuation. Dude, is Chelsea Wolfe lip singing or does she normally do vocals this well live? And I said, flawless, always. That's the magic. I'm so excited you're experiencing it in earnest. And then in all caps, you said, this is nuts.
It is. The other reason that I think this particular album is worth talking about is because she's capable of a vocal performance like that and has a style that's so distinct, and it's not usually paired with music like this.
Right.
And that, as an instance, a musical example, is so rare as it is that it gives people, I think, a unique opportunity to essentially use his Spun as a gateway drug, because it does the beauty of heaviness in a very distinct and almost straightforward way that I think you and I have in our bones a little bit more than other people. I mean, the very common conversation of like, if I get to talk in music with somebody and we get, 2 steps into metal, 2 steps out of 2 million, to me, you can go way deeper than whatever conversation I'm having. And usually someone says, I just can't handle the vocals, man. I mean, I do understand where you're coming from. And there are a lot of bands I can't listen to myself because the vocals are still too bad in metal. The bar is very low. But when it's done well, when heavy music is done well, it's really different than abrasion. It doesn't feel antagonistic anymore. Right. It actually feels soothing.
As long as the texture of it goes with the thing, that's what matters, instead of being like, it has to be this exact. I think the problem with so much metal heavy stuff is for it to be a genre born of rebellion and of nonconformity. There's so much conformity. There's so much templating. There's so much you do it this way for this way's sake. There's so much genre purism. And that's why Chelsea Wolfe is at once baffling and so refreshing, because you're like, it's like it almost hadn't occurred to people that you could pair these two things together, and you needed the right person who liked both of those things and knew how to ingest them and put them back out in the world in an authentic way. But it's weird that it took this long. But, if we had to listen to 500,000 bands that you can't read their logo to get to one Chelsea Wolfe, then I suppose it was worth it.
So we'll certainly dive into some examples of how this plays out. But to me, that's maybe the more important thing that I can get across to people listening to this episode and maybe not having been exposed either to this record and or other forms of heavy music that can actually feel beautiful. And even in situations where something like female vocals are paired with heavy music, there's either a lot of shtick or it's an experiment in contrasts where you go from heavy to quiet and back. And contrast works sometimes, but not usually are the quiet and the loud moments shoved together just to the point to where it's produced correctly. And we'll certainly get into how that happened too. But it's produced well enough to where you can take the vocals that would normally not belong over sounds like this, enough production to make it audible in the mix to where you can hear what she's doing, but in fact to have it so correctly and precisely paired to where it doesn't feel forced. It feels like these things are executing somehow at the same volume, which is outrageous, right? Because she's not singing like that in comparison to what is certainly the level coming out of these amps. And yet it's so pristine and it's so rare that this is such a great opportunity to allow a record to introduce you to the feeling of heaviness and how it lasts, and hopefully to give people an opportunity to say, maybe it's worth going into some music that's not Chelsea Wolfe after this, that I hadn't really given a chance to before, because I thought that all heavy music was abrasive and it would always feel uncomfortable to listen to. This to me is an opportunity for people to feel what it feels like to be able to put on headphones and put on an extremely heavy record at whatever maximum volume you can handle before it hurts. Mm-hmm. And it just feels good.
So good. Let's do the recommended if you like thing. The use case would be, I have stagnated a little in my listening habits. I need something that's not like close enough to the things I already listen to that an algorithm's going to recommend it to me. This is the moment where you get out of the Netflix loop of more things like the thing that I already enjoy watching where you're like, I just want to watch a really good movie. I want to watch like an Oscar type film tonight. This is that moment where it's like, if you can dedicate yourself to it for the runtime, you're going to be rewarded a lot. And you may not come back to this record often, but it'll pull you left of wherever you are. And you'll be really glad you did it, I think.
You could nearly just write down the moments in the album that you like and then use that as a branching off point to go find other records that you might like. Because, I mean, all slammed into one. And I mean, metal, generally speaking, will slam a lot of genres together, but there are many distinct ones here, so many that it's unusual. Sludge, doom, post-metal, black metal, drone, electronic music, industrial, and then whatever we would file Marilyn Manson under, right? Like, all of these things are smashed together in ways that don't usually exist or coexist. One, in a sensible way, or two, in a way that doesn't make you cringe. We have seen the industrial and gothic thing try to borrow or coalesce with metal subgenres before, and it doesn't feel good, man.
I think it's been done well, arguably lots of times, but in a way that is well known. Like, the only people to do those things well, other than her, I think, are Nine Inch Nails, Godflesh, and White Zombie. And so you're talking in all of those cases about like high art, auteur type artists with really like high aesthetic sensibilities who had a lot of control over, this is how you need to experience this thing. And I think all of those groups get into a lot of the same themes lyrically, thematically.
Yeah, and one hop away from that is Rammstein. And like, you can see how that goes wrong, right?
Yeah.
As soon as someone tries to create a copy of a Rammstein record, we're done.
That reminds me of when we were on the Atlanta podcast and you were like, yeah, I'm really into metal. And the guy was like Disturbed? What?
That turned around quickly. Disturbed? No. How about Meshuggah?
Oh, that's right.
Interesting. Yep.
Why were those the two?
All right.
Anyway, let's get into it. Where do you want to start? You want to talk about the people, the place, the things, the noises, the flux, the hiss, the welt, the groan, the what?
I think now that we've already given kind of a tour of the different places we want to go, I think it's now worth pushing into, almost in a contradictory way, what Chelsea Wolfe herself, the individual, isn't necessarily doing on this record because of the contributions of other people. Because certainly, having an artistic endeavor named your actual name means that people are going to associate that with the individual. So there's, first of all, a recurring sense of collaboration from her towards artists in general. Hearing her talk about how she grew up and who she associates with has led to a number of stories about being involved with art communities in general. So you already have an appreciation for and a willingness to collaborate with true artists of a lot of different forms, not just musical. So one, there's an approach of collaboration. So even on the record previous to this, right, on Abyss, she worked with Mike Sullivan from Russian Circles, which gives a thing an entire vibe, right? Russian Circles is one of the many branches you could take from this episode and check out for sure. It's kind of like a post-metal band, really good. So there was already a history of this, but then here it kind of blows up, right? First of all, contributions from some of our literal, I think, favorite people or associated with our favorite acts at the very least. One is Troy Van Leeuwen from Queens of the Stone Age and A Perfect Circle. So he plays guitar on 16 Psyche and Vex. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting is he's in that video for 16 Psyche 2, which has a lot of Power Man 5000 vibes going on in it. And I remember watching that video and being like, man, they really did the like fisheye lens at the forehead level thing. And then come to find out, like, when they were talking to the producer about the video, she was essentially sending Marilyn Manson videos over to him as an inspiration. So
and like
A+ Execution,
and
I
like
guess.
Smashing Pumpkins and Deftones, and I felt weird for hearing some of those reference points, the like 90s alt, other heavy and light type stuff, but she leaned into it in a cool way. Like, I was a teenage goth in the 90s. I appreciate that.
Troy is going off in the entire video, and it's real fun. But also his guitar work, and there's a couple of things we can talk about as well about what I see as general Queens of the Stone Age influence on these songs, which are interesting. But his guitar work is great. You can also just see how even his rhythmic tendencies through those two bands contributed to the feel here, and it made something really unique in the metal sense generally, not just with what Chelsea Wolfe contributed to, but actually to blending like some really unique rhythmic ideas. I still hold, which could be a podcast in itself, the common rhythm of Queens of the Stone Age, which if you ever ask me, like, what does that band sound like? I have a thing in my head. It's that dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, like driving.
Yeah.
And
I can't believe in 15 years we've never had that conversation.
But that is essentially black metal with different accents in the drumming. So there's already this connective tissue between rhythmic types in metal subgenres. And so his involvement pushes, I think, obviously the songs he's on, but the feel of the whole album in this really unique direction. And so you've got him here, and then making a guest appearance on Vex is Aaron Turner of ISIS, the band, which is another offshoot.
Sorry you can't wear that t-shirt anymore.
They had to stop selling their own merch. Now the only things they sell literally can't reference their own band name.
Republicans broke up a great band.
And let me just pause, because here is where I'm going to insert, for no particular good reason, an ISIS song. Aaron Turner also plays these days in bands like Sumac, Old Man Gloom.
Man, Sumac is so good.
All of it.
God.
He definitely does the barely controlled chaos sound really well.
Yeah. And you know, as soon as he drops in that part of Vex, you're like, is that Aaron Turner? Like so singular. I love that she went out and got really, really singular artists for this with distinct sounds. But you're right. There's a moment either in Spun or in 16 Psyche where Troy plays 4 ascending notes, and it's that weird Queen scale. It's the pentatonic with the notes removed. And you're like, that's very Queensy. That was the moment where I was listening to it before I realized he was playing on it. And then I was like, it's Troy.
Yep.
But it was a great hook in for me. But it's so good because it's so like kind of dark, like kind of Devil's Cabaret type of sound, you know?
And
very cool guitar work.
And Vex apparently actually began, quote, as almost a black metal song with blast beats throughout. And then Chelsea and Ben Chisholm, who we'll talk about some more for sure, because that's a really important component of all this.
BC.
They stripped it back to what they refer to as a more industrial electronic sound, which, again, just there's no one here to argue with me, but I just want to say the fact that that's what they're saying here helps prove my point a little bit. The fact that you can take a black metal song and then turn it into an electronic industrial song by tweaking it is sort of what I'm saying. There's so much rhythmic similarity.
I like that. I think for them, it's just dials on the fader of like who's going to show up to the sad kid rave. Like, what kind of party do we want it to be tonight?
Exactly.
Like real aggressive and pissed off. Yeah, there's a weird like Cocteau Twins, almost Depeche Mode-y thing that she does really, really elegantly to go from the real brutal to the real dancey. Dancy's a weird word. It's not dancey, but vibey is real cool.
Right. And yeah, to your point about Aaron Turner being a perfect fit here, if you have the lyrics "perfect psychosis," you should be calling Aaron Turner.
That's the title of Sumac the band's memoir, which also has Nick, the drummer from Baptist, in it, like one of the best heavy drummers out right now. So a step away from another really insanely cool heavy band.
So I just wanted to get those two called out of the way because there's no way that we could go very long without mentioning a Queens of the Stone Age and ISIS connection.
Mm-hmm.
So we should get to, I think, what's actually the meat of the collaboration and contribution, which we mentioned is Ben.
Mm-hmm.
So Ben is kind of the only constant in the Chelsea Wolfe project. So co-producer, longtime collaborator, multi-instrumentalist, which is my favorite term that people use to refer to people who are outrageously and annoyingly good at everything.
Yeah.
People who can pick up percussion and wind instruments and acoustic instruments and whatever and be able to do it. And pretty much anytime, I mean, the Chelsea Wolfe show itself was a great example of just like being able to create texture with whatever seemed to be nearby. Some mixture of effects and instruments and computers, and I don't know, but just the ability to fill out the equivalent of an entire band by yourself seems to be his MO, and he seems to nail it.
You know, that's a thing I don't think we've ever touched on in this podcast is like, if you come across a unique and really talented artist who develops a sound and has a thing, these hyper creative type of artists generally have that thing in common where they have one or two of those types of people around. It's like a CEO, COO thing. They have a really good like utility player that they have these insane visionary ideas, and then they have a person that can, I know how to do that. I can figure that out. Like I know how to route these things and get that sound that we're going for and dial it in. Troy is that for Queens. Like Troy's the backbone of the band in a lot of ways. So it's cool that she has been to do that.
Yeah, and just as one of the many examples of how they collaborate together, apparently, especially during the recording of this record or during the planning of it, he and Chelsea separately carried field recorders around to just capture whatever they happen to be hearing. And so, for instance, in the culling, during what is, again, a really heavy part, you hear a coyote howling and a passing motorcycle, because you can't really disconnect those two things if they're happening at the same time, and you're using a field recorder. Ben himself gives us an interesting segue, I think, into one of my favorite connection points here, which is Converge. We covered Converge's Axe to Fall in one of the favorite things you and I have been able to talk about so far, I think.
Their super collaborative record, very much in the same spirit.
This relationship kind of kicked off with, so Jacob Bannon, the vocalist of Converge, has a side project called Wear Your Wounds, which is significantly different than Converge, and also features the guitarist from the Red Chord, which is another band I love. So Ben released a 7-inch split with Wear Your Wounds in 2012. It was his solo project, but he went under the name Revelator. Okay, so now starting to merge these threads together. So we mentioned that Ben seems to be, I would definitely not go so far as to say, the secret behind Chelsea Wolfe. Chelsea Wolfe is more than enough herself as an individual, right?
Yeah.
But definitely this project is being propelled in a particular direction thanks to his approach.
To their partnership.
Right.
Like he inspires her and vice versa.
So to that end, at the Roadburn Festival in 2016, where Converge was playing, which Roadburn in general is just an amazing festival. It's worth reading about on its own right. The way that they do curation and theming each year makes me really angry that I don't just decide to go every year.
But I think we should both take a moment to thank Roadburn for existing, because that's one of those fixtures like the BBC, that's doing so much good and supporting and amplifying like really unique creative voices.
Yeah.
So thanks, Roadburn.
Absolutely. If more things were like Roadburn, we would be better off in music, period.
One of my favorite Roadburn things is when somebody had to drop out of a headlining or direct support slot, and Earthless, I think, had already played a set and had to come back and do, I want to say, a 90-minute slot. And then they wound up releasing a record of it because it was such a scorcher of a set. So their Live at Roadburn album is 2 tracks, like 45 minutes and 30 minutes. It's like a side and a side. And it is brain-frying stuff.
Chef's kiss.
Yeah. Another heavy, they're more like acid rock, hard rock, space rock. I don't know. I hate doing genre stuff, but it's like guitar ass music. And that was a cool, how long ago did we see them? It's probably been 2 years, maybe 3 years now. Maybe not that long.
Yeah, something like that.
Time's a flat circle.
So Roadburn 2016, Kurt Ballou, who we're going to come back to in a minute, guitarist from Converge and,
Tonehound.
Absolutely. Producer from God City Studios, his own. He asked Ben to be a part of the Converge set at Roadburn.
Called
Blood Moon.
Hell yeah.
Because they're on brand all the time. Their brand is so good.
And the Jacob Bannon posters we'll definitely share on social. The Bannon artwork for the Blood Moon set was the moment when you and I both were texting and we were just like, why are we missing this? Because they did Jane Doe and they did Blood Moon, same. Yeah. So we could just die.
Maybe we already did. So Kurt asked Ben to be a part of this, but he said the way he described it was, we want you to be the brain of this set, doing backing vocals and keys and adding undertones and layers. So the reason I thought that was helpful to bring out is just to underscore the perspective that we're giving on Ben isn't conjecture or undue.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, other people are able to identify his ability to draw texture and layer out and create mood underneath music, which, I mean, go listen to some Converge if you haven't, but there's not a lot of room there often in which someone would say this really needs more to it. But apparently, like, some of it was being able to play some of the songs, like, speaking of Axe to Fall, one of the songs off of that was Wretched World, that they did the thing that bands do in studio sometimes where, like, the song deserves more instrumentation and production than we can do as a 4-piece band, and we're going to do it anyway. And
Converge Live, to be clear, is like, it's 4 people. It's that, no more, no less, and it's just 4 dudes with weapons of war running directly at you. And the Blood Moon set was a curation of all the weird stuff. Anytime they had a weird song on a record that was a divergence from the normal, like, just absolute blast of noise, straight up pure punk stuff, they were like, let's do all that at once, because we never play those songs. So that's what made the Blood Moon thing really special.
So through agreeing to do that, Ben also was able to bring Chelsea in to do part of this. And it definitely, again, kind of underscores the ideas that we've been talking about here about how collaboration is leading to this. And I hope by the end of the episode, we've dropped like 50 different band names because we're already halfway there, I think. So on top of it itself being a great set, one of the things that stood out to me listening to an interview with Chelsea in which she was talking about the Blood Moon set, which, she is a huge fan of Converge. And so, she's seen them play. She understands what that experience is like, and it's monolithic in its own right. And so she said that what was interesting was what her and Ben were able to bring to the table meant that people in the audience who love Converge were experiencing Converge songs in a new way for the first time, in a way that brought out a very different emotion. And she said, I don't think they had ever seen their fans cry before. And I think it's just a perfect snapshot of what Chelsea Wolfe, the individual, and the artistic project is able to do, to take what is essentially the cred band of all cred bands in hardcore music And by pure participation in their songs, to be able to transform the actual emotion from, energy. I wouldn't call it anger. That's not really what you're experiencing at Converge. You feel like
catharsis. Yeah.
To be
or
able
power.
to, right. And in some sense of family
Yeah.
in an interesting way, to be able to shift that entire dynamic mood, that's a capacity to move things and change the experience of things that very few people would ever have.
Yep.
And so it's just such a great snapshot of what she's capable of, and a great snapshot, I think, of what this album can lead you into discovering, I think. So I know I'm pushing on that a lot, but to me, that's really the magic of this whole record. And we can talk some more about some of the places where that really stood out.
One of the things that's always stood out to me about Chelsea is how expertly and differently she's managed her aesthetic. Everything about Chelsea Wolfe feels like an art project, like your friend that has a gallery opening next week, down to the cover of his Spun, right? Very deliberate, looks very much like an art print. The way that she wields fashion, I think, is really incredible. Not a thing that you typically associate with heavy music. Most of the people in this genre dress like bums, or like intentionally it's an anti-statement. But she uses fashion and collaborates with wardrobe designers really, really expertly, and celebrates other people, her collaborators in the visual world as well. And I think that speaks to her quality as an artist, that she is so good at controlling the way that you see and hear and experience all facets of her. And I know a lot of artists do that, but there's just such a particular way that she goes about it, that she presents it, that she talks about it, really like forces you to engage with all aspects of it. You can't have one without the other, and she makes you think about it, and she makes you thankful for it. And that's a thing that I appreciate about her, and I think sets her apart.
And to that end, she did actually collaborate with a couple of artists on her album artwork for this. And she did that in Salem, Massachusetts, where she also recorded the record at God City Studios with Kurt Ballou, thanks to what I can only assume was now a really positive relationship with everyone after that Blood Moon set. And that's an aspect of this album that, again, can't be understated. The production of it is flawless. It's weird to be such a fanboy of a producer the way I am of Kurt. Yeah, there was, in one review, they said, his signature crushing heaviness may have become a cliche, but paired with Wolfe's beautiful voice and brilliant writing, it's a match made in heaven. And just this particular moment in time and being able to record it and produce it in a way, again, where such a beautiful voice could come through with the heaviness of the music that's behind it is a rare feat itself. But even kind of circling into Chelsea's aesthetic and some of the perspectives that you've already brought up, she mentioned when talking about recording this album in Salem, she said, "There's a lot of anger on this album for what my female and genderqueer antecessors have had to face, so recording in a town that historically murdered women for being witches was fitting."
The other thing, talking about the building itself, I've never heard of all the other bands that we've seen talk about recording at God City, somebody think about the space so thoughtfully. And she said in one of the interviews, sometimes a building has no effect on the recordings, but sometimes it becomes a character in it. New York City's the character. I'd say the God City building played a big role in this record. The building has 3 levels. The basement dungeon, where most of the drums were recorded, and drums are central, and we obviously have to talk about that. The middle studio area, where all the guitars were recorded, and the upstairs apartment and vocal room. So I thought of it almost like hell, limbo, and heaven. Each level had its own personality. So the use of space, like a gallery, in the way that she formed the mix of the album and layered it, that's super thoughtful. Like, that's the difference between a good artist and a great artist right there.
Yeah, and to your point about drums, so she worked on this record with drummer Jess Gowrie from the band Horseneck.
so sorry you didn't get to see Jess live because holy shit.
Yeah. Well, apparently one of the main reasons, if not the reason for making sure to record with Kurt for this record was that Jess was going to be the drummer, and they knew it would be a drum heavy record. And the way Kurt records drums, again, if we haven't talked about that enough over now 2 episodes, hopefully you get the point. Both in the studio and live, the sound that he's able to get from drums and mix together is outrageously unique in a way that makes heavy music sound completely different.
You need the best pair of headphones that you can find or steal. And like Cliff said, you need to listen as loudly as you possibly can because nothing does the drum sound justice like getting right up on it. There's a combination of it's present in the mix, like it's pretty upfront, like we talked about with Queens and Rated R and that kind of ZZ Top front of the stage weirdness of the drums, but also they're massive. They're like, imagine hearing John Bonham with this kind of a mix of drums. It's a little bit like that where you're like, how fucking big is this kit and how hard is this person playing? But it's also not, it's not like cheeky. It's not trying to be big. It's just real big. I've never heard a drum sound quite like it, I don't think.
And that sound plays so well together with the subject matter, for lack of a better term, and approach to the record as an art project. Like we talked about before, right? Everything feels like an art project. His Spun feels like one with a lot of intention. And so to that point, that feeling of being as close up and as loud as possible highlights, I think, what Chelsea was trying to do on this record. One quote that stood out to me, which is possibly now my favorite quote out of any music review that I've ever read. The bombast is overwhelming. And while there's an admirable zeal to her drive for making almost every second as intense as possible, it begins to get numbing. The musical equivalent of the Passion of the Christ that pushes for so long that it starts to lose its force.
Oh, wow. It's a Christian record.
Yeah, in the way that the Passion of the Christ was a Christian movie, yes. I also love that this was supposed to be, I think, a negative statement about her record, but I think I would maybe stop making music forever if I had ever made something where someone said, this is a little too much like the Passion of the Christ. It's so relentlessly uncomfortable. Like, great, perfect. That's really what I'm looking for.
Shut it down, everyone. We've done everything there is to do.
But it plays into what she said was really the topic of this record and what she wanted to bring to it in a way that I really didn't appreciate until we started learning more about it. So she said that in writing this record that she wanted to open up more, quote, but also create my own reality. I wanted to write some sort of escapist music and songs that were just about being in your body and getting free. And this part of the quote is what I think is really interesting about this and honestly really timely, like, because this record came out in September of 2017. So as with the many milestones in reality that we have, clearly one thing happened in 2016 that started turning things upside down, at least in America. And so she talks about, wanting to create her own reality, write this sort of escapist music. She then just kind of starts talking about her context. She says, you're just bombarded with constant bad news, people getting fucked over and killed for shitty reasons or for no reason at all. And it seems like the world has been in tears for months. And then you remember it's been fucked for a long time. It's been fucked since the beginning. It's overwhelming and I have to write about it.
Like that Sturgill Simpson lyric we may or may not have talked about in the episode. Don't call it a sign of the times because it's always been this way.
And there's something really unique and fitting about it's not anger. She's not writing punk as a way to get it out of her body. In fact, what she seems to be trying to do instead is really musically representing this. It's overwhelming. Everything is terrible. And now that I'm sitting with how everything is terrible, it's making me realize, honestly, everything's been terrible. And that overwhelms me. And I think that's worth drawing out too from even a lyrical perspective, because I think it's also easy to kind of put her in the gothic category alongside a lot of people that she musically emulates. But this is neither nihilism, nor is it emo. It's none of the Hot Topic bullshit that you would kind of expect from something with this much eyeliner. This is not choosing to be permanently sad. This is choosing to say, you know what? It's so uncomfortable to live in this reality sometimes. I'm literally going to make an art project that feels the way that feels and not allow you to escape it for a while.
The feeling of overwhelmed is because these problems seem so big. So I'm going to take big ideas and sounds to kind of push back against it. The interviews for this record are so good. One thing she said is each song has many worlds inside it. A way for me to bring the songs together on this record was a list of short words with big meanings: flux, hiss, welt, groan, swarm, spun, scrape, and strain. They became a sort of guide. Flux represents movement and flow. Hiss is life force and white noise. Welt is the brutality of life. And groan represented sensuality and death. So real sensory words, real visceral words. I think of the word visceral and viscera and ideas around the body a lot with Chelsea Wolfe. Like lyrically, she takes you to that place a lot. And she talks a lot about being in her own head and her own body, dealing with anxiety and insomnia, and the same way that Kurt Cobain had so many preoccupations with anatomy because of his sicknesses that had plagued him since childhood. There's a very physical component to her music, her kind of approach as an artist, and that gets reflected in the sounds here.
Yeah, one of the ones that really stood out to me, and again, we can't highlight any portion of this album without accidentally highlighting like 5 genres of music that she's compiling together. Mm-hmm. But to me, one of those examples of where it really captures you is in the song Offering. And she's writing lyrics that have to do with this feeling that we're talking about, right? Human life as a lesson, you will see the mess of me. And sings these sort of almost obtuse and vague lyrics, but that constantly give you this feeling of like, it seems like she's going somewhere and she's really not. And yet musically, we have so much going on at the same time. The vocals and the vocal performance in Offering reminds me of like Björk or even like Isley, like the female vocals that are nearly chromatic feeling, and it feels like they're sailing. There's some physical distance above the music, and yet this is happening over what's essentially like a 9 Inch Nails song from the 90s, and yet with a chord progression that Earth would write. Like she really frequently on this album especially uses chord progressions that are just actually drone. They don't ever actually progress in the way that you would expect. She does the 1 2 3 1 1 2 3 1 a lot, mm-hmm. which is Earth's entire repertoire for all like 25 of their records or whatever. But like just being able to pull those moments out, or like it creates at once this sensation of movement, but actually underlying that feeling of movement where it feels like she's taking you somewhere vocally, the music itself intentionally is just coming back to the same droned root note. And you at once feel like your body is taking you in a direction and then forcing you to stay in the same place. It's such an uncomfortable feeling the more you sit with it. And for my first, however, handful of listens, I guess, this time through being intentional about it, it sort of led me to initially walk away with like this, I wish this album was actually shorter, I think, because it's great, but it drags, and I feel like it should move differently or be shorter and more punchy. And only after a while of sitting with it did I realize like, shit, that's what she meant.
Right.
That's actually the way I'm supposed to be feeling,
right?
Being
because it never
inside
resolves.
This art project.
Yeah. I was listening to it on the noise canceling headphones and listened to it like 5 times in a row the past couple of days. I kept getting to the end of Scrape without realizing it, and then Spun would start again, and they're like, oh God, it's the beginning of the record. So it feels like a really long record, and then it feels too short after a while. So I think pointing out the lack of progression, the lack of resolve, the kind of anxiety and tension there really plays with your sense of time. And I know we're going to talk about D'Angelo in the next episode, but they both play with time in really incredible ways. And then there's a mastery there. Did you read about the inspiration behind Offering?
I'm not sure. Tell me, Kyle.
So in an interview with Cosmo Magazine, which is an amazing sentence that will never come up again on this podcast.
Well, kudos to whoever at Cosmo made that happen then.
That is Eliza Thompson. So shout out to her. We do a good job on Twitter of recognizing the people that write these articles and do a great job of pulling out insights. But we don't really ever cite them on the podcast. So thank you for all the people that help us draw some of these insights. Eliza asked her, when you released Vex last month, the first single, you talked about how it was inspired by a mysterious hum that resounds in the deep sea. How would you describe Offering when she released that as a single? Chelsea said, I've always written these sort of psychedelic love songs to nature, which is, sign me up for that. And I use a lot of natural imagery and symbolism, and it's present on this album as well. Offering is written from the perspective of the Salton Sea in Southern California. And that was a connection that made me sit up in my chair, being a person that loves Joshua Tree and the Yucca Valley and Route 66 and all the weird, there's an energy there that's really palpable and cosmic, and you can't help but feel it when you're in the area, but it's also really deathy, right? It doesn't support life in a lot of ways. And Salton Sea is super interesting. She points out, you get out of the car and the smell of the place is almost visceral. It really leaves this kind of physical impression on you, but it's still really beautiful. It's this strange resort anomaly to see in the middle of the desert. So I wrote the song imagining the Salton Sea as this female character and writing from her perspective. She's this wonderful resort, but she couldn't keep up. The world wanted too much from her, and eventually she started to wilt, becoming poisonous and toxic to the point where everyone abandoned her. The Salton Sea sits right on the San Andreas Fault, and late last year there was a swarm of almost 200 earthquakes directly beneath it over a couple of days. That's what caught my attention again, because I haven't visited there in many years, so I wrote the song after that. It's a really strange place. When you walk along the shore, you're basically walking on the skeletons of fish. So combine that with, she cited Walt Whitman as an inspiration, another person who has an interesting connection with nature and personification of nature. And we mentioned field recording earlier. There's also, when you hear the pages of a book turning, it is specifically a book by Walt Whitman that they're using. So that's weird, putting the ghost of Walt Whitman in the record a little. So her relationship to the body is interesting, but her relationship to nature, the global body, the universal body, is also interesting to me and compelling. So much of this record is about feel, right? It's very tactile and visceral, and she very much lives in the world, and the corporeal component all over this record and all over her body of work, no pun intended. It's kind of become one of the main things about her art for me.
And it's interesting that she talks so much about feel without really ever saying feel. And you mentioned circling back accidentally to Spun at the top of the record after listening through. I think on that is a really great encapsulation of what you're mentioning, because first of all, again, it's done what we've talked about musically. It's smashed things together. There's blast beats 3 minutes in, and then they go back out, and then around 4:20 into the song, she starts doing spoken word. But she moves through these lyrics, and at the end of it, just starts repeating "and all and everything or nothing" over and over again. And somehow that's the thing. That's the overwhelming sensation of it all. Mm-hmm. It can somehow all be, as she said, everything is so fucked and has been for a long time, but it's it's all a part of it. It's all and everything, or it's nothing at all. And we don't know what any of it is, but that sensation of it is just that existentialism that we have to sit with, and she forces you to here.
And the way that she connects those things perfectly musically and lyrically is white noise. There's all kinds of feedback and strange looping and weird moments of almost indecipherable layered noise throughout this record. And she talked about how she was inspired learning that Carl Sagan said that 1% of TV and radio static is relic sound from the Big Bang, which is one of those like hits blunt thoughts where you're just like, what? You never watch TV the same way again in your life. She said, I think something about that connection to the origin is comforting, and I've had a strong affinity for white noise since I was a kid. I was talking more about confronting the chaos of the world with your own internal chaos, accepting the mess of yourself and finding strength through that. So that external sense of the world and the corporeal body in yourself, like it's all kind of one thing. As we're saying it out loud in this room, thinking about Chelsea Wolfe as like this being a mindfulness exercise and her having like a supreme zen when this record is all about chaos and like terror and really feelings. But there's such a centeredness, and that I guess kind of comes through in the vocal performance in a lot of ways. It's really not a thing that I had thought about until now. That's cool.
Yet another shocking album that you can, in fact, meditate to if you would like to.
Very much so. She did talk about how she loves Swans and Sun, and we just talked about Sun. And I've been talking about how the brand new Sun record, Pyroclast, is like the most meditative thing. I can't stop listening to it.
It's convincing me day by day.
Yeah. And increasingly as we get older and so many things compete for our attention, this idea of loop appeal you and I have talked about, it becomes more important to me as I get older. Like if you can just keep me in a place for a while and just steady my mind, whatever it is, if it's chaos, if it's horror, whatever it sounds like, as long as it keeps me there and anchors me and I can drive my ship through it, no matter how stormy, then I'm into it. And this has that in spades. Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.